When I first saw the clearing in the woods where my cabin used to stand, I didn't scream. I didn't cry. I just stood there in the silence of the North Carolina mountains, watching the dust settle over the splintered remains of my father's legacy. It wasn't just a building they had destroyed. It was 60 years of memories, hand-carved beams, and the only place on earth where I felt truly safe. The people who did this, the Pinecrest Homeowners Association Board, thought they were teaching a lesson to a stubborn outsider who refused to bow to their arbitrary rules. They thought they were the ultimate authority in this valley. What they didn't realize was that while they spent their weekends measuring the height of people's grass and dictating the color of porch swings, my family spent their lives operating in a world where real power resides. They thought they were punching down at a lonely cabin owner, but they had just declared war on a family of federal agents who knew exactly how to dismantle a corrupt empire from the inside out. The story really begins 3 years ago when I inherited the cabin from my father. It was a modest, beautiful structure built long before the developers arrived and carved up the surrounding forest into a gated community. Because my father's land predated the HOA, we were technically in a gray zone. For decades, it wasn't an issue. But then came Marcus Thorne, a retired corporate lawyer with a God complex and a vision for a perfectly uniform mountain retreat. Marcus became the HOA president and immediately set his sights on my cabin. To him, it was an eyesore, too rustic, too unrefined for his vision of luxury. He started sending letters demanding I could pave my gravel driveway, replace my cedar shakes with composite shingles, and, most absurdly, pay 15 years of backdated HOA fees that I never legally owed. I tried to be reasonable. I sent them the original deeds, the surveys, and the legal grandfather clauses that exempted my property from their jurisdiction. I even offered to attend a board meeting to shake hands and find a middle ground. But Marcus didn't want a middle ground. He wanted submission. Every time I drove up for a weekend apiece, I'd find a new orange violation sticker slapped onto my front door. They started fining me $500 a day for noncompliance. When I ignored the fines, they filed a lien against the property. I stayed calm, documenting everything, and filming the interactions whenever Marcus would trespass on my porch to scream about property values. I told him once, very clearly, that he was playing a dangerous game with things he didn't understand. He just laughed and told me that in this county, he was the law. The escalation happened fast. While I was away in D.C. for a month-long work project, the HOA board held an emergency hearing. They used a falsified surveyor's report to claim my cabin was structurally unsound and a fire hazard to the rest of the community. Using their influence with a local building inspector who happened to be Marcus's brother-in-law, they secured a fast-track demolition order. They didn't even wait for the mandatory appeal period. They wanted me gone, and they wanted the land for a new community clubhouse. I got the call from a sympathetic neighbor on a Tuesday afternoon. By the time I raced back down the coast and hit the mountain roads, it was too late. The heavy machinery was already loaded onto trailers, and the site was a graveyard of broken timber. Marcus was standing by the road, hands on his hips, wearing a smug grin that suggested he'd won the ultimate victory. He looked me in the eye and said that if I'd just paid my dues and followed the rules, I'd still have a roof over my head. He told me to consider the demolition costs a final bill. He had no idea that my brother, Sarah, is a lead investigator for the FBI's Public Corruption Unit. He didn't know my uncle is a high-ranking official within the Department of Justice, or that my mother spent 30 years as a forensic accountant for the IRS. When I called the family that night, the tone wasn't one of grief. It was one of clinical, calculated precision. My family doesn't get loud when they're angry. They get very, very quiet. My brother arrived 48 hours later with a team of people who weren't there to swing hammers, but to serve subpoenas. We didn't start with the demolition. We started with the money. My mother spent 72 hours straight combing through the Pinecrest HOA's public filings and tax returns. Within a week, she had uncovered a massive embezzlement scheme. It turned out Marcus and the board hadn't just been bullying neighbors. They had been funneling hundreds of thousands of dollars in maintenance fees into a shell company owned by Marcus's wife. While the financial walls were closing in, my brother was busy with the local sheriff's office. It didn't take long to find out that the building inspector hadn't just made a mistake with my cabin survey. He had been paid a $20,000 kickback to sign off on the emergency demolition order. Because the mail had been used to send the fraudulent fines and the demolition notices, it became a matter of mail fraud, which brought the federal hammer down even harder. The morning of the raid was a surreal moment of poetic justice. I sat in my truck at the entrance of the subdivision, drinking coffee, as a fleet of black SUVs rolled past the manicured gates. They didn't stop at my cabin ruins. They went straight to Marcus Thorne's $5 million mansion. I watched from a distance as the man who thought he owned the mountain was led out in handcuffs, still wearing his silk bathrobe. The look of pure, unadulterated shock on his face when he saw my brother, showing his badge and explaining the litany of federal charges, was worth more than any settlement check could ever be. But we weren't done. The HOA as an entity was sued into oblivion. We didn't just go after the board. We went after their personal assets for the intentional destruction of property and civil rights violations. Because they had bypassed the legal appeals process, the board members were held personally liable. They had thought they were protected by the corporate veil of the HOA, but that veil is paper thin when you commit felony fraud. The legal battle lasted a year, but the outcome was absolute. Marcus Thorne lost everything. His house was seized, his law license was revoked, and he's currently serving a 7-year sentence in federal prison. The other board members were forced into bankruptcy to pay for the punitive damages the court awarded me. But the money wasn't the point. I didn't want to pay out. I wanted my history back. With the settlement funds, I didn't build a modern glass box or a sprawling mansion despite them. I hired a team of master craftsmen who specialized in historic restoration. We went through the debris pile and salvaged every piece of original timber we could find. We found a hand-carved mantel my father had made, scarred but intact. We rebuilt the cabin exactly as it was, down to the inch, using the original blueprints my father had tucked away in a safe deposit box years ago. Today, I'm sitting on the porch of the new old cabin. The air is cool, and the scent of pine is thick. The HOA is gone, dissolved by a vote of the terrified homeowners who realized they'd been presided over by criminals. The gate at the entrance of the community is gone too, replaced by a simple road sign. People sometimes walk by and admire the cabin, commenting on how well it fits into the landscape. They don't know the war that was fought over these few hundred square feet. Looking back, I realized that Marcus Thorne's biggest mistake wasn't just underestimating my family's profession. It was underestimating the power of a home. He saw a building as a line item on a spreadsheet, something to be manipulated or removed to suit his ego. He didn't understand that a home is an extension of a person's soul. And when you try to tear that down, you're not just breaking wood and stone. You're inviting the kind of storm you can't survive. My family still comes up here for the holidays. We sit around that salvaged mantle, and sometimes we talk about the case, but mostly we just enjoy the quiet. My brother likes to joke that of all the high-profile stings he's ever pulled off, the Great Cabin Caper was his favorite. But for me, the victory isn't in the arrests or the ruined reputations of entitled people. The victory is in the creak of the floorboards under my feet and the knowledge that some things are worth fighting for, no matter how powerful the person across from you thinks they are. In the end, bullies always rely on the silence of their victims. They count on you being too tired, too poor, or too scared to push back. They never expect you to have the resources to push back harder than they ever dreamed possible. So, if you ever find yourself facing down someone who thinks they can take what's yours just because they have a fancy title or a little bit of local power, remember my cabin. Remember that the law is a tool that works both ways, and sometimes the quietest person in the room is the one you should fear the most. The mountains are peaceful again, and as I watch the sunset over the ridge, I know my father would be proud. We kept the land, we kept the legacy, and we taught a whole town that real authority isn't about the rules you make for others, but about the integrity you hold within yourself. Justice isn't always fast, and it isn't always easy, but when it arrives, it has a way of leveling the ground and letting the truth grow back in its place. The cabin stands tall today, a silent witness to the fact that no matter how much you try to demolish the past, the foundations of a family are built on something far stronger than wood and nails. It's built on the promise that we look out for our own and we never, ever back down from a bully. That is the true law of the mountain. Would you like me to find some other similar stories of HOA disputes that ended in dramatic legal victories?